In light of the Jon Jones Tom Aspinall situation, a lot of people have been using the word duck in social media. It's a word that's been circulating in combat sports for a long time. And because of that situation, I thought this would be a good opportunity to go through the top 5 biggest ducks in UFC history and compare the severity of each one. To actually define what a duck is basically when two fighters are in circumstances where they should fight each other, but one of them opts out of the fight and avoids it. A non-UFC example of this will be the time that boxer Riddick Bowe, when he completely drops his heavyweight title to avoid facing the other champion at the time, Lennox Lewis. One thing that would not be considered a duck is if one fighter has an injury that pulls them out of the fight. Obviously fighters can fake injuries, but most of the time it is legitimate because of how common injuries are in MMA. So with all that being said, we can start off with our number 5 spot, the time that Michael Bisping avoided Robert Whittaker. When Michael Bisping stepped up to face Luke Rockhold at UFC 199, he was a huge underdog that no one really expected to win. But surprisingly, on short notice, with one eye at the age of 37, Bisping would knock out Luke Rockhold in one round to become the first British world champion in the UFC. Rockhold did not take the immediate rematch, so now there was a discussion about who Bisping faces next. There were 3 names on the list, one being Jacare Souza, Yoel Romero and Robert Whittaker. Romero seemed to have the best case at the time considering he had a win over Jacare Souza, and he was on a 7-fight win streak at the time. Whittaker was on a win streak of 5, but he wasn't high enough on the rankings to fight for the title. So Yoel Romero seems like the next in line, which is why people were confused when the UFC announced that Bisping's next fight would be against Dan Henderson. Henderson was ranked number 13 at the time, and he was riding a win streak of 1. The only reason that fight being a long time ago. And they knew that Bisping was not going to last long as a champion, so this was their excuse to finally have a pay-per-view in the UK. Bisping would barely win the fight by decision, suffering 2 knockdowns in the process, which proves why the fight was made in the first place. In the meantime, Romero just knocked out number 2 ranked Chris Weidman with a flying knee, whereas Whittaker would go on to knock out Derek Brunson in the first round, followed by number 3 ranked Jacare Souza. Normally, Bisping would have to face Whittaker or Romero, but an injury forced him out of action for a year. So to make things easier, the UFC matched up Romero with Whittaker for the interim title, so whoever wins would fight Bisping. It was a very closely contested fight, but over 5 rounds, Whittaker would win by decision. So Whittaker was officially next in line for the title, and they even did a face-off between the two to set up the fight. But there was just one roadblock for Whittaker in terms of getting the fight, as former welterweight champion Georges St. Pierre had just re-signed to the UFC. GSP knew he could beat Bisping, and Bisping knew GSP was the bigger fight, and also not as dangerous. So only a month after Whittaker versus Romero, Bisping would be signed to fight Georges St. Pierre at UFC 217, essentially leaving the deserving contender Whittaker to sit out and wait for the title shot. GSP would beat Bisping. GSP would vacate the title immediately, meaning Whittaker would automatically become champion, and order was restored. Our number 4 spot goes to Yair Rodriguez avoiding Zabit Magomedsharipov. Rodriguez was a wild, entertaining young prospect in the featherweight division. He would begin his UFC career 6 wins in a row, before being tested against former champion Frankie Edgar, who would completely destroy Rodriguez in 2 rounds, which exposed Yair's lack of wrestling. To bounce back, the UFC offered him the fight between fellow prospect Zabit Magomedsharipov, who was a very promising prospect at the time, with solid striking, wrestling and submission ability. But Yair completely refused to take the fight, and since he had no real valid reason to not take the fight, and since the UFC has no tolerance for that sort of thing, they just completely cut Yair from the UFC, unless he agreed to re-sign and fight Zabit. So he did at UFC 228, but Yair still didn't seem like he wanted the fight, and he's learned that he can't just refuse fights for no apparent reason. So Yair pulled out due to an undisclosed injury. People were suspicious, but both fighters went their separate ways for a while before being matched up again in 2020. So it was looking like the fight would finally happen, until Yair hurt his ankle and the fight was called off again. To make things even weirder, Yair would be suspended by USADA for 6 months for not showing up to 3 USADA tests. Ultimately, Zabit would retire, meaning the fight would never happen. At number 3, we have Jermaine Randamie avoiding Chris Cyborg. In 2017, the UFC decided to make a new division, the women's featherweight division. The main reason for this is that Chris Cyborg had now been signed to the UFC, who was the best and most popular fighter outside the UFC in women's MMA. However, the relationship between the UFC and Chris Cyborg has been very sour and too complicated to get into in this video. So even though they created this division for the sake of Chris Cyborg, Their first world title fight in that division was Holly Holm versus Jermaine Randamie. Cyborg naturally would feel disrespected by that move, as leaving Cyborg out of that fight made no sense. What made fans even more unhappy is the controversy that happened in the fight between Holm and Randamie. Randamie would commit several fouls across the fight, including 2 blatant punches after the bell. Randamie would win the fight by decision and become the first women's featherweight champion. There was no other option besides facing Cyborg next for the title. At that time, Cyborg had won 18 fights in a row, and Cyborg was expected to run through Jermaine Randamie, until Randamie completely refuses to fight Cyborg, claiming Cyborg was on steroids. This refers to the time that Cyborg tested positive once in 2011. Cyborg would test positive once under USADA, but she was granted exemption, as the substance was only a dietary supplement. After some negotiation, the UFC simply decided to strip Randamie of her world title. Cyborg would then face Tonya Evinger for the vacant world title and win the fight by TKO to become the featherweight champion. Our number 2 spot goes to Mark Coleman, avoiding Brock Lesnar. Coleman spent most of his career in Pride FC, alongside guys like Fedor Emelianenko, Fedor being his last fight in that promotion, before Pride FC disbanded in 2007, which meant that Pride's whole roster of fighters had to find themselves a promotion to fight in. Fedor moved over to Affliction, others went to Strikeforce, and Coleman signed to the big organisation, the UFC. The UFC took their time to find an opponent for Coleman, but they eventually decided to give him Brock Lesnar for his first fight back in the UFC. Lesnar only had 1 win and 1 loss in the UFC at the time, his loss being at the hands of Frank Mir. But what may have scared Coleman's fight with Heath Herring, Lesnar dropped him immediately and proceeded to dominate him on the ground for 3 straight rounds. So when the UFC offered Coleman the fight, he said it himself, Lesnar is a 275-pound monster. So Coleman would reluctantly accept the fight, but not long after he'd pull out at the hands of an Achilles injury. For those who don't know, an Achilles injury is very serious and can take most fighters out of action for at least a year, which is why it confused people when Coleman signed to fight with Mauricio Shogun Rua 3 months later, leading people to believe that he lied about the injury. Shogun would beat Coleman, Lesnar would go on to become a champion, and ultimately, Lesnar and Coleman would never fight. And that brings us to our number 1 spot. If you can guess what it is, like the video, because you should all know what it is. The number 1 duck of all time is very recent, Jon Jones ducking Tom Aspinall. We should all know the situation by now, but if you don't, I'll go through it anyway. This actually isn't the first time Jon Jones has done something similar. A long time ago, Jon Jones was scheduled to fight Dan Henderson at UFC 151, but Henderson pulled out due to an injury. The whole thing was on very short notice, so they could only find 1 late replacement for Henderson, and that was Chael Sonnen. UFC 151 was a very weak event, meaning that if they took away the title fight, they'd have to scrap the whole card altogether. But knowing the risk of a short notice fight, at the request of his coaches, he stepped out of the fight, cancelling the event. Jon Jones obviously wasn't scared of Chael Sonnen because they'd fight later on, and Jones would destroy him in a single round, but there were signs there that Jones wasn't an anytime, anywhere sort of fighter. Fast forward 7 years later to the year 2020, after his controversial win over Dominic Reyes, he'd announced his move up to heavyweight. Jones had said that his move up to heavyweight would take some time because of all the weight he had to put on. So he sat and waited for the heavyweight title picture to make sense for him. One fight that Jon Jones had his eye on was the rematch between Stipe Miocic and Francis Ngannou. Ngannou would knock out Stipe cold in round 2, so now talks of a potential fight between Francis Ngannou and Jon Jones started to materialise. But Jones decided he needs a lot of money to face Ngannou. Some would say that he's ducking by pricing himself out of the fight. So the heavyweight division moved on without Jones, as Francis Ngannou took on Cyril Gane. Ngannou would beat Cyril Gane by decision. Following this fight, Ngannou would have surgery on his knee and also tried to negotiate a better contract with the UFC. Neither Ngannou or the UFC could settle on a contract, so Ngannou vacated his title. In January of 2023, the UFC was very quick to make a new title fight, as Jon Jones suddenly made his return to face Cyril Gane in March of the same year for the vacant heavyweight title. People were quick to notice how eager Jones seemed to be to fight Gane, as opposed to Ngannou. Jones would submit Cyril Gane in 2 minutes to make him the new heavyweight champion. It was very impressive, but Jones had agreed to fight Gane for a guaranteed purse of $6.4 million. And if you remember, Jones was only willing to face Ngannou for more than $10 million, meaning that Jones took the fight because he knew Gane would be an easy fight for him. And this is where Tom Aspinall comes in. Aspinall was a very promising fighter in the heavyweight division. He stopped almost all of his opponents in the first round. Tom had great grappling, great striking, really fast hands, and it seemed like he was the future of the heavyweight division. He would suffer a setback in the form of an injury versus Curtis Blades. He'd take a year off to recover, and he'd return to face McIntyre Burra, who he'd knock out in 45 seconds. At this point, Tom was in no position for a title shot. The top contender at that point, though, was Sergey Pavlovich, who just knocked out Curtis Blades in one round. Pavlovich was on a massive streak of 6 first-round knockouts in a row, and people thought maybe he'd be the one to face Jon Jones next. Instead, the shot was given to former champion Stipe Miocic, which wasn't as bad at the time as it would be later on. Pavlovich was the backup opponent for the title fight in case one of them pulled out. Conveniently, Jon Jones pulled out due to his shoulder injury, so now it was expected to be Stipe Miocic versus Sergey Pavlovich for the interim title. But Stipe would not take the fight, so there would not be a heavyweight title fight unless someone stepped in to face Pavlovich, 2 weeks away from the fight. So Tom Aspinall stepped in to face Pavlovich on 2 weeks' notice. So when the fight happened, Aspinall knocked out Pavlovich in one round in the first minute. So Aspinall was now the interim champion, which usually means you get a guaranteed shot at the title. But with Jones saying he'd be out of action for a year, and Aspinall knowing that he might not get a guaranteed shot at the title, he decided to defend his vacant belt against Curtis Blades in a rematch. As usual, Aspinall would knock out Blades in the first round, so now the UFC had a choice, and Jon Jones had a choice. Who's the more deserving contender? Stipe Miocic, 42 years old, hasn't fought in 3 years, where he got knocked out by Francis Ngannou, or Tom Aspinall, in his prime, interim champion, one defence to his title, and even with a leg injury he'd fought 6 times since Stipe's last fight. But regardless of all that logic, they'd give the shot to Stipe anyway, as Jones and Miocic would headline UFC 309. The fight went as expected, with Jones stopping Stipe in round 3. So after the fight, Jones was put on the spot. He could either retire or say that he's fighting Tom Aspinall. But what he did instead was say that he wants to fight again, but that he doesn't want to fight Tom Aspinall for very strange reasons.
Specifically, has he said or done to make him an asshole?
There's just a lot of people on his nuts right now.
But what has he done, though?
Coming up with Jon Jones T-shirts, buying a little duck, and just the little shit that he does. He's annoying to me. And that's my own personal. He annoys me. I get to you guys, you find it entertaining, but I find him annoying, and I just don't like him. And at the end of the day, if I give him the opportunity to fight me, I want to be so compensated. I want to say it, I want that fuck you money, honestly. And that's just what it is. That's just what it is. Or else my life is perfect without him. I don't need him at all, and he needs me. And that's a good place to be in a negotiation.
Jones would also go on to say that he's willing to fight Alex Pereira, the light heavyweight champion, but not Aspinall. And because of how high profile the ducking is here and how blatant it is, I've got it as number 1 as the biggest duck in UFC history. So there you have it. Like and subscribe, leave a comment. Goodbye.